There's trouble in paradise. Nations in the South Pacific are sick of us simply thinking of them as sunny playgrounds for postcard holidays. Many have significant problems which threaten their very existence. In the last few months, Scott Morrison has been trying to convince leaders around the Pacific that Australia is looking out for them and wants to help. But the Prime Minister isn't receiving much thanks in return. And that's because China is on the march and seems prepared to splash more of its cash in the region. How it's doing that, though, as we discovered, is alarming, at times sinister. Right now in the Pacific, seeing red has a lot of people seeing red. 2 months ago, the Pacific nation of Kiribati switched its allegiance from Taiwan to Communist China.
So this is very clearly somebody tailing us.
We're not being paranoid.
No, this is actually very real.
Now, as the first foreign journalists to try to report here since, we're under surveillance, then house arrest.
My other instruction is to transfer you, only you, to a cell.
3,500 kilometres west, in the Solomon Islands, a glimpse of how China might buy its alliances in the Pacific. So they rang you and said, we've got $1 million for you if you come to the hotel and accept the switch to China.
Yes.
And just to the north, in war-torn Bougainville, with its legendary gold mine, we reveal a Chinese master plan. You would be quite happy to do business with China?
Oh, yes.
How do you describe China's actions in the Pacific?
One word, expansionist.
Captain Jim Fennell was the intelligence chief of the US Navy's Pacific Fleet, watching China's moves there on a daily basis. Now he's warning Pacific nations swaying to China's influence to beware. China has told all these Pacific countries that it just wants to be their partner. It wants to be involved economically. Do you not believe them?
Well, we have evidence that shows that when they say they want to be your economic partner, the end result is they become your economic master.
China demands no country in its diplomatic sphere can recognize Taiwan. And there's no doubt the communist superpower has a grand strategic plan in the Pacific, extending its alliances further and further south. And with those alliances, massive infrastructure, like this gigantic wharf in Vanuatu that the country doesn't need, but could dock an aircraft carrier. With recent back-to-back recognition of China by the Solomon Islands and Kiribati, and possibly the soon-to-be independent Bougainville, we asked Jim Fennell to join us on a Pacific mission to report on China's intentions.
They're interested in this area because it's essentially the lifeline or the choke point between America and Australia and New Zealand. China has built the Navy that people said they were never going to build. China has deployed their fleet to places they said they were never going to deploy. They believe that they're supposed to be the rightful leaders of this new global order. You know, the British century, the American century, now we're going to have the Chinese century. That's their vision.
In September, Manasseh Sogavare, Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, announced his country was ditching recognition of Taiwan,
chosen to be on the right side of history,
for Communist China. A move Deputy Opposition Leader Peter Kenalira says was more a dash for cash than considered diplomacy. Are you happy that your country has switched allegiances from a democracy to a communist state?
For me personally, I'm not. We should have taken our time and not be dictated and marching to the beat of a more dominant country. It's really China first, not Solomon's first.
And here in the Solomons, we found direct evidence that China's influence could have a sinister side. So they rang you and said, we've got $1 million for you if you come to the hotel and accept the switch to China.
Yes.
Daniel Sudani is the premier of the Solomons' largest island, Maldives. He says he was offered a $1 million bribe to back his country's switch to China.
You're suggesting that there are a lot of corrupt politicians in your government?
Yes.
But $1 million just to be pro-Chinese, I mean, that's a hell of a way to do business.
Oh, it is. It is a new way of doing things. It's really dangerous.
You think there's one bag of money, there's got to be more.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They don't come, single.
Weeks ahead of our visit, we requested an interview with the Solomons Prime Minister about his sudden recognition of China. While we're here, we try again in person, also wanting to ask him about his refusal to investigate the bribery allegations made by Premier Soudani. As we're waiting, a high-level Chinese delegation leaves the Prime Minister's office. Then, hot on their heels, Manasseh Sogavare himself hurries out, head down, and clearly in no mood to talk. Mr. Prime Minister, 60 Minutes Australia, sir. We'd just like to ask you a couple of questions about China. Mr. Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, can we ask you about the bribery money, please? Amid all the claims of bribery, corruption and kickbacks, it appears the Chinese have another novel approach to increasing their presence here, like leasing this entire island of Tulagi for the next 75 years, all 10 square kilometres of it, including the deep-water port, oil and gas rights, fishing rights, forestry rights and tourism rights. The Chinese want all of it, and the locals are not impressed.
When I heard about it, I thought that China is a communist country and the Solomon Islands is a democratic country.
Margaret Manu is an unlikely enemy for China to make. But here on Tulagi, where land ownership is matrilineal, she's the voice of her people. And the people here didn't want to be owned by the Chinese?
No.
60 Minutes has obtained a copy of the lease document, which is almost comical if it wasn't so sinister. The agreement was signed by Tulagi's provincial leader, who locals say hasn't been seen here since. And, luckily for Margaret and her people, it was ruled unlawful when it became public. So there was no consultation?
No, not at all.
So the Chinese company just came in here and tried to have the agreement signed by one person, and that was it?
That's what happened, without the people knowing what's going on.
And what we're seeing now from our visits to the islands here is that the Chinese are coming in with soft power and lots of cash to buy out local officials to gain access to ports and airfields and resources that give them a controlling monopoly in the islands and thus give them control over this vital sea lane.
Coming up, not welcome in paradise. We're being followed by a government car. Why the government of Kiribati
There's something to do with the kinds of money that's being brought in.
doesn't like nosy reporters.
What's happening to us now is basically house arrest.
That's next on 60 Minutes. There's something both threatening and absurd about being tailed by a mysterious black sedan in a country that, essentially, has only one road. It's mid-morning on our first day in Kiribati, the latest Pacific Island nation to recognise communist China and dump Taiwan. We're being followed by a government car. Now, whether that's Kiribati government or whether that's somebody from the government operating under Chinese instruction, who knows? But it's a very, very strange thing to happen in a place like this. With us is Captain Jim Fennell, former intelligence chief of the US Navy's Pacific Fleet, and someone who's witnessed firsthand how China does business in the Pacific.
It could be that the Chinese have said, as part of this deal, you're going to have to pay more strict attention to who's here and what they're doing.
Few foreign journalists come here, none since the country's abrupt switch of allegiance to China. One reason is that Kiribati requires a draconian film permit that journalists working in the region say is almost never granted. And gives the government the right to completely censor any news reports. We know we may meet trouble, but have come anyway. A move we'll soon find is supported by very senior figures in Kiribati.
What's happening to us now is basically house arrest.
On arrival at our hotel, we're immediately placed under house arrest and threatened with imprisonment.
If you keep arguing with me, my other instruction is to transfer you to a cell. We have no right in the country.
The sensitivities are running high here because Kiribati is critically important to China's Pacific Master Plan. The immense swathe of ocean territory controlled by this tiny island nation is smack in the middle of a secure sea lane China wants to establish, all the way to the Antarctic, which it calls the Blue Economic Passage.